Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Amjad Abuloum, the head of LIM at BTC. Today we're presenting some guidance on the ePortfolio evaluation that we hope will be helpful for both the evaluation panel and students. Before we start, we'd like to talk about the purpose of the evaluation, and we say that the purpose is just to judge that students have achieved the 9 competencies of BTC and that they have the evidence to prove this. So just to make sure that our students have achieved all competencies of BTC. For this purpose, we've developed an evaluation sheet. Basically, at the top you see a table, an evaluation table divided into 3 sections. You will see on the next screen. The 3 sections are: 1, the student's personal journey, which talks about the journey of the students at BTC for 2 or 4 years or whatever. And then the students' course-related assignments that the students have completed, during the courses that they have taken at BTC, and the students' reflections and observations with any suggestions for improvement for the program at BTC, so in the future the program will look much better than what it is now. As you see here on this screen, we see the evaluation sheet, and this is the table we just talked about. You see the 3 sections here: students' personal journey, and students' assignments, and students' overall observations and improvement suggestions. At the top here you see the 9 competencies: competency 1, 2, 3, and competency 9. Okay? Now, for each competency, as you see, we have 2 categories. We have acceptable, we have exceeds. So 2 categories for each. So we want to make sure that the student, have achieved the competencies, and we have 2 categories to do so. Now, let's talk more about this. To achieve the basic competence in general, the student need to provide some evidence. We call them indicators or artifacts or whatever for every competency. Now we expect that most of the evidence will come from students' assignments and students' personal journey, because these are the most obvious for students, and they don't require lots of preparation and things. So in general, students' assignments for the courses will be a good evidence of achieving some of these goals. However, some evidence, especially for competency number 9, the last one, reflective practice, ethics, and professional growth, it may need some thinking, in fact, and some work that comes through what we call students' overall observations and improvement suggestions. And this work is really based on students' engagement and involvement in the different activities and courses and things at BTC during the program of study. So we expect most of the evidence to come from just students' assignments and students' personal journey. Now, let's talk more about these indicators. As you see here on the right side of the screen, we have the 3 sections that we talked about with the 2 categories for each competency: acceptable and exceeds. Now, there is a need to have 1 X for each competency. Just 1, either in the students' assignments or students' overall observations and students' personal journey. But most likely the X will come from student assignments, because this is what most students will be presenting, we expect, through assignments. So the acceptable students will have, will present the assignments. These are the artifacts. Maybe we'll present 3 of these assignments, and he or she thinks that these assignments will cover the 9 competencies. Now, the excellent students will have more than 1 X, in fact, not just for the acceptable category, but for the exceeds category. and not just for student assignments, but also for a student's personal journey, maybe, and the last one, the student's overall observations. Now let's talk more about this. Now we have two samples. Sample number one, I call this one the excellent students. The excellent students will have more than one X, as I mentioned before, for each competency, may have in fact. And by the end, you will see lots of X's in fact in the exceeds category. Look here carefully for these students, for example. For competency number one, I see one X for the exceeds category and one for the acceptable category for the first competency. If we move to the second competency, student development, I see two X's in fact, two X's under the exceeds category for both student assignments and students' personal journey. Now for diverse learners, we see the same. We see one for acceptable and one for exceeds for both student assignment and students' overall observation. So look carefully. But this is not necessarily the case for all students. As I mentioned, this might just be the case with a few students. Now, for some competencies, the excellent students may have some X's in the acceptable category. Like for example, look at this here. If you look carefully, for diverse learners, you see an acceptable for students' assignments. It's not exceeds, just acceptable. The same thing for assessment. For the assessment competency, we see one for student assignments under the acceptable category, and one and for acceptable category for also the students' overall observation. This is for competency number, the assessment competency. The same thing for other things. Now, in general, if you look at this student here, we think that this student exceeds, the normal competencies level, and he or she will be marked as a distinguished competence. Now, in fact, this student needs also to have a good presentation, at the end. But we'll talk about this later on. Now, let's talk about the acceptable student. This is a sample for the acceptable student. As you see, most of the X's are just under the acceptable category. This is why we call the student an acceptable student, because most of the X's will just reside basically under the acceptable category, and most of them will just come from, very likely to come from the student's assignment. As I mentioned before, we expect most students to be of this kind, just presenting assignments, 3 assignments that they think will cover all competencies, and they will present them at an acceptable level, the way we see this table here in this table. So we can mark the student as an acceptable, at acceptable level. Now, as I mentioned before, we need to focus on the presentational skills for the student, not just the competencies. This is why we've developed another table below the first table, which talks about the presentation, again with 3 sections and 3 categories. The 3 sections are quality of content, just to make sure that the content is of a good quality, and the confidence and fluency of delivery. We want to make sure that the student is really confident and fluent in delivering the presentation itself, and the student can stand in front of people and just talk and present and defend points and things. And the last thing is just to use the time wisely, just to make sure that the student can present everything within 15 minutes, not exceeding 15 minutes. So we have unsatisfactory, in case the student is is below the level for one or more than one of these sections. The same for satisfactory, and the good is the student who has a good quality for the content of the presentation, who is confident and fluent in delivering the presentation, and who uses the time wisely, the 15 minutes. Now let's talk about the three categories at the bottom of the with evaluation sheet, which represent the final results. So by the end, and you will see this on the next screen. We can jump there. You see down here, we have not yet competent. This is the final results. It's down here, all the way below. And the second one is the competent. Third one is the distinguished competence. You see? So let's talk more about these. Now the student is either competent in each of the competencies or not yet, demonstrated those competencies. So now, not yet competent means the student has, failed to present, evidence and artifacts that demonstrates the competency or the mastery of these competencies. Now, for students who demonstrates a higher level of competency, we have this category there, as we mentioned before. It's the distinguished competencies with lots of X's in the in the exceeds category, and with more than one X for each competency for the 3 sections. So again, this is one, we just need to have the X, marked here under one of these by the end. So the student is either not yet competent, or distinguished competence. Now we have final comments here. Now we hope that the majority of students will be graded as competent. This means that the students have been doing fine, and which means also that the faculty and staff have been doing fine, which is really good. This is exactly what we're looking for. But also we're looking for some exceptional students who achieve a higher level in these competences, and we mark them as distinguished competence. Now, for the student to be a distinguished competence, in fact, he or she has to have the majority of evidence indicators in the exceeds category, as I mentioned before, with more than one for each competency, and he or she should give a presentation that is really good. Again, the sample I showed you, the first sample for the distinguished students, is basically a distinguished, competence. Now, what about the not yet competent students? We hope that a very small number of students will be given the not yet competent, judgment. Now, this is really important. Now, we just need the panel to do a few things. In fact, if you have a student who is not yet competent, and you mark this at the end as a final results, now the panel needs to tell the student exactly the shortcomings in the evidence, the weaknesses, why he or she is given this not yet competent, judgment. And not just this. The panel needs to give a brief advice, excuse me, to what the student needs to do to improve him or herself. And by the end, the student should have the opportunity to be reassessed before the end of this semester. That's all. Thank you very much, and enjoy your time at BDC.